Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life's Facade. Curtis Robertson stood in his marble-floored foyer, adjusting his Armani tie as he prepared for another day at his private security consulting firm. At 42, he had built an empire from nothing, a company that provided high-end protection services to Fortune 500 executives and celebrities. His steel-gray eyes reflected the same intensity that had made him a decorated Marine before transitioning to civilian life. The sprawling estate in Malibu Hills was a testament to his success. Kristen, his wife of 15 years, descended the grand staircase in a flowing silk dress, her auburn hair perfectly styled. At 38, she still turned heads wherever she went, and Curtis felt a familiar surge of pride. Their son, Tommy, a bright 14-year-old, was already at his private academy. Another late night at the office? Kristen asked, her voice carrying a subtle edge that Curtis attributed to the stress of planning their anniversary party next month. The Henderson contract needs finalizing, Curtis replied, kissing her forehead. This deal alone will net us 8 figures. Kristen's smile seemed forced, but Curtis dismissed it. His business demanded absolute focus, and he'd always trusted his wife to handle their domestic life. She'd never given him reason to doubt her loyalty, or so he believed. Curtis had met Kristen at a charity gala 16 years ago. She was a struggling artist then, working part-time at an upscale gallery. He'd been immediately drawn to her passion for life and her genuine warmth. Their courtship was intense and brief. Within 6 months, they were married in a lavish ceremony that made the society pages. What Curtis didn't know was that Kristen had grown resentful over the years. She felt like a trophy wife, beautiful but ultimately decorative in Curtis's empire. Her art career had withered as she played the role of the perfect executive's wife. The loneliness had created a void that someone else was now filling. That someone was Trevor Hatfield, a 35-year-old personal trainer who worked at the exclusive club where Kristen spent her afternoons. Trevor was everything Curtis wasn't: carefree, spontaneous, and completely focused on her when they were together. He was also dangerous in ways Kristen couldn't imagine. Trevor had a history that would have sent Curtis into a calculated rage. Born into poverty, Trevor had clawed his way up through various schemes and manipulations. He'd targeted wealthy, lonely wives before, but Kristen represented the ultimate prize. Through her, he'd gained access to information about Curtis's clients, security protocols, and most importantly, the family's financial assets. As Curtis drove his black Porsche toward downtown Los Angeles, he was mentally reviewing the Henderson contract details. James Henderson, a tech mogul, had received credible death threats and needed Curtis's most sophisticated protection package. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes, high-reward case that energized Curtis. Meanwhile, back at the Robertson estate, Kristen was preparing for another afternoon with Trevor. She'd told Curtis she was attending a museum board meeting, but instead, she was meeting her lover at a discreet hotel in Beverly Hills. The lies came easier now, after 8 months of deception. Trevor had been pushing for more than just an affair. He wanted Kristen to leave Curtis, but more importantly, he wanted access to Curtis's business accounts and client information. Trevor had connections with some very dangerous people, mercenaries and criminals who would pay handsomely for the kind of intelligence Curtis's company possessed. That evening, Curtis returned home earlier than usual, hoping to spend time with Tommy before dinner. He found his son in the gaming room, focused intently on his computer. "How was school, champ?" Curtis asked, settling into the leather chair beside his son. Tommy looked up, his expression troubled. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Before Tommy could continue, Kristen appeared in the doorway. "Dinner's ready," she announced, her timing conveniently interrupting the conversation. Curtis noticed the quick glance between his wife and son, a silent communication that set off his internal alarm system. Years of security work had honed his instincts for deception, but he'd never thought to apply them to his own family. "What did you want to tell me, Tommy?" Curtis pressed. "It's nothing important, Dad. Just school stuff," Tommy mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Curtis let it go for the moment, but filed the interaction away. Something was building in his household, and his instincts were telling him to pay attention. As they sat down for dinner, Curtis studied his family with new eyes. Kristen seemed nervous, constantly checking her phone. Tommy kept glancing at his mother with what looked like disappointment or even anger. The perfect family tableau was cracking, and Curtis began to wonder what lay beneath the surface. That night, as Kristen slept beside him, Curtis stared at the ceiling, processing the subtle signs he'd been unconsciously noting for weeks. The late returns from errands, the new clothes and jewelry she claimed were gifts from friends, the way she'd become protective of her phone. His methodical mind began assembling a case against his own wife. Chapter 2. The Brother's Warning. 3 weeks later, Curtis was putting the finishing touches on the Henderson security detail when his half-brother Benny Ross called. Benny, 5 years younger and a detective with the LAPD, rarely contacted Curtis during business hours unless it was urgent. "Curtis, we need to talk. In person. Tonight." Benny's voice carried a gravity that immediately put Curtis on alert. "What's going on?" "Not over the phone. Meet me at Murphy's Pub on Sunset at 8. Curtis arrived at Murphy's to find Benny already nursing a whiskey, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by grim concern. Benny had always been the more emotional of the two brothers, while Curtis was calculating and controlled. Despite their different approaches to life, they'd maintained a close bond since their mother remarried when Curtis was 12. "Remember when you asked me to run a background check on that trainer at Kristen's club?" Benny began without preamble. Curtis's blood chilled. He'd made that request casually 3 weeks ago, more out of professional habit than suspicion. "Trevor Hatfield. What did you find?" "More than you want to know." Benny slid a manila folder across the table. "Trevor Hatfield isn't his real name. He's actually Trevor Galvin, and he's got a record. Identity theft, fraud, and suspicion of involvement in 2 home invasions where wealthy wives were specifically targeted." Curtis opened the folder, his expression remaining neutral even as rage began building inside him. Photos, police reports, and financial records painted a picture of a sophisticated predator who targeted affluent women for information and access to their family's wealth. "There's more," Benny continued. "I've been doing some unofficial surveillance. Curtis, Kristen's been meeting with him regularly. Hotels, restaurants, his apartment. And yesterday, I saw him photographing the security system at your house while she distracted the guard." The pub's ambient noise faded as Curtis processed this information. His wife wasn't just having an affair. She was collaborating with a criminal who was gathering intelligence about his home and business. The betrayal cut deeper than simple infidelity. It was a violation of everything he'd built and protected. "There's something else," Benny said reluctantly. "Tommy knows. I saw him following Kristen last week. The kid's been tracking his mother's movements." Curtis's hands clenched into fists. His son had been trying to tell him something for weeks, and Curtis had been too focused on business to listen. Now Tommy was carrying the burden of his mother's betrayal alone. "How long do I have?" Curtis asked, his voice deadly calm. "Trevor's been asking Kristen specific questions about your client list and security protocols. I think they're planning something big. Maybe a coordinated attack on one of your clients, using inside information." Curtis closed the folder and stood up. "Thank you for bringing this to me." "Curtis, what are you going to do?" The look Curtis gave his brother was one Benny had seen before, in the eyes of Marines about to enter combat. "I'm going to handle it." That night, Curtis drove home with his mind already formulating a plan. He wouldn't simply divorce Kristen and have Trevor arrested. That would be too easy, too clean. They had violated his trust, endangered his son, and threatened his life's work. The punishment needed to match the crime. As he pulled into his driveway, Curtis made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't confront them directly. Instead, he would let them continue their plan while he prepared his own. The art of warfare, which he'd mastered in the Marines and perfected in business, would now be applied to a very personal battlefield. Curtis entered his house to find Kristen in the living room, reading a book. She looked up with a smile that now seemed like a mask to him. "How was your evening with Benny?" she asked. "Fine. Just catching up," Curtis replied, settling into his chair with practiced normalcy. "How was your day?" "Oh, the usual. Museum committee work, lunch with the girls." Every word felt like a knife twist, but Curtis's expression remained unchanged. He was already thinking several moves ahead, planning an elaborate game where Kristen and Trevor would be the unwilling participants in their own destruction. "I think I'll work from home tomorrow," Curtis announced casually. "Spend some time with Tommy." He caught the flash of panic in Kristen's eyes before she recovered. "That's wonderful. He's been wanting more time with you." As Curtis headed upstairs, he was already mentally drafting the first phase of his revenge. They wanted to play games with his life? He would show them what a real predator looked like when cornered. Chapter 3. The Son's Burden. The next morning, Curtis waited until Kristen left for her museum committee meeting before approaching Tommy. He found his son in the backyard, shooting baskets with an intensity that suggested he was working through frustration. "Can we talk?" Curtis asked, sitting on the pool deck. Tommy stopped dribbling and looked at his father with eyes that seemed older than his 14 years. "About Mom." The directness of the question confirmed Curtis's suspicions. "What do you know?" Tommy sat beside his father, staring at the basketball in his hands. "I've been following her sometimes. I know about the guy, Trevor. I've seen them together." Curtis felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Pride that his son had the instincts to recognize deception. Heartbreak that the boy had been forced to confront such ugly realities about his mother. "How long have you known?" 3 months. "At first, I thought maybe they were just friends, but then I saw them." Tommy's voice trailed off. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I hoped it would stop. I thought maybe Mom would remember that she loves us and end it." Tommy's voice cracked slightly. "But it's getting worse. She's telling him things about your work, about our house. I heard them talking about your clients." Curtis placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You did nothing wrong. This is not your responsibility. What are you going to do?" Curtis studied his son's face, seeing maturity beyond his years. Tommy deserved the truth, or at least part of it. "I'm going to protect this family. But I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say when I say it." "Can you do that?" Tommy nodded solemnly. "Are you going to hurt them?" The question hung in the air. Curtis could have lied, could have offered comforting platitudes about handling things through proper channels. Instead, he chose honesty. "I'm going to make sure they can never hurt us again." That afternoon, while Kristen was at her rendezvous with Trevor, Curtis began implementing his plan. He started by installing additional surveillance equipment throughout the house, cameras and recording devices that Kristen and Trevor wouldn't detect. He wanted documentation of everything. Next, he called his most trusted employee, Omar Shannon, a former Navy SEAL who handled Curtis's most sensitive operations. Omar had been with the company for 8 years and had proven his loyalty repeatedly. "I need a complete workup on Trevor Galvin, also known as Trevor Hatfield," Curtis told Omar. "Everything. Financial records, associates, current operations, weaknesses. I also need surveillance on him and my wife. Full coverage." Omar asked no questions. In their line of work, personal security sometimes became very personal indeed. Curtis then contacted Jeffrey Galvin, ironically sharing a surname with Trevor, though no relation, who was his company's legal counsel and strategist. Jeffrey specialized in complex scenarios where multiple moving parts needed coordination. "I need to restructure some assets," Curtis told Jeffrey. Quietly, "I want certain accounts moved, properties transferred, and a new will drafted. Make it look like routine financial planning." By evening, Curtis had set multiple operations in motion. The hidden cameras were already capturing Kristen's nervous behavior as she prepared for another lie-filled evening. The surveillance on Trevor had begun, and Curtis's assets were being quietly repositioned. When Kristen returned home that evening, she seemed more agitated than usual. Curtis suspected Trevor was pressuring her for more information or faster action on whatever they were planning. "Everything all right?" Curtis asked over dinner. "Just tired. The committee work is more demanding than I expected." Tommy shot his mother a look of pure disgust that she didn't catch, but Curtis did. His son was struggling with the knowledge of his mother's betrayal, and Curtis knew that Kristen's continued lies were only making it worse. That night, Curtis accessed the surveillance feeds from his home office. He watched Kristen make a phone call from their bedroom, speaking in hushed tones. The audio pickup was clear enough to hear her side of the conversation. He's getting suspicious. I think Tommy might have said something. Yes, I can get the client files, but we need to move faster. How much longer do I have to keep this up? Curtis saved the recording and added it to his growing file of evidence. But evidence wasn't his end game. It was just ammunition for what was coming. Over the next several days, Curtis maintained his normal routine while his team gathered intelligence. Omar's reports painted a picture of Trevor as a man with significant debts to dangerous people. He owed money to loan sharks connected to organized crime, and his scheme with Kristen was apparently his plan to pay them back. More disturbing was the revelation that Trevor had been in contact with known criminals who specialized in high-end home invasions. The plan wasn't just to steal Curtis's client information. They were planning to rob the Robertson estate while making it look like a random crime. Kristen would be the surviving victim who could provide them with security codes and asset locations. Curtis realized that his wife wasn't just betraying him. She was actively participating in a plan that could have resulted in his and Tommy's deaths. The revelation crystallized his resolve. This wasn't just about adultery anymore. It was about survival. As Curtis prepared for bed that night, he looked at Kristen sleeping peacefully beside him. She had no idea that her husband knew everything, or that he was planning a response that would be both creative and devastating. In Curtis's mind, the game had already begun. Kristen and Trevor thought they were the hunters, but they were about to learn what it felt like to be prey. Chapter 4. The Hunt Begins. Curtis spent the following week gathering intelligence while maintaining the facade of normalcy. Omar's surveillance revealed that Trevor had 3 associates: Ricky Hartman, a former burglar with expertise in high-end security systems; Mario Knight, a violent enforcer with connections to organized crime; and Wendell Camacho, a technical specialist who handled electronic surveillance and communications. The plan they were developing was more sophisticated than Curtis had initially imagined. They intended to stage a home invasion during the upcoming anniversary party, when the house would be full of wealthy guests. Kristen would ensure that certain security measures were accidentally disabled, and the crew would make off with cash, jewelry, and most importantly, Curtis's encrypted client files. But Curtis was already 3 steps ahead. He began his countermove by feeding Kristen false information about the anniversary party, changing security protocols, and relocating his most sensitive files to a location she couldn't access. "I've decided to move the party to next weekend," Curtis announced over breakfast one Thursday morning. Kristen's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "Next weekend? But I've already confirmed with the caterers for the 15th. Change it. I need to accommodate the Henderson family schedule." Curtis watched her carefully. "They're flying in specifically for our celebration." The mention of the Henderson family, his most high-profile clients, made Kristen's eyes light up with an avarice that disgusted Curtis. He could practically see her calculating the additional wealth that would be present. That afternoon, while Kristen was supposedly at the museum, Curtis met with his core team at a secure location. Omar had brought detailed surveillance photos and recordings that painted a complete picture of the conspiracy. Trevor's been asking Kristen specific questions about guest lists, security rotations, and safe locations, Omar reported. He's also been photographing the exterior of the house from multiple angles. Jeffrey, Curtis's lawyer, spread out financial documents across the conference table. "I've completed the asset transfers as requested. If something happens to you, or if divorce proceedings begin, Kristen will find that her access to marital assets is extremely limited." Curtis studied the surveillance photos of his wife meeting with Trevor. In one image, she was handing him what appeared to be a key. "That's in my home office," Curtis realized. She's given him access to everything. "There's more," Omar continued. "We've identified their meeting location, a warehouse in Long Beach. It appears to be their staging area." Curtis made a decision that would set the final phase of his plan in motion. "I want you to arrange for some additional guests at the anniversary party. People who won't be on the official guest list." Omar understood immediately. How many? Enough to handle 4 men who think they're professionals, but have never faced real professionals. That evening, Curtis found Tommy in his room, ostensibly doing homework, but clearly distracted. "How are you holding up?" Tommy looked up from his textbook. "It's hard, pretending everything's normal." watching her lie to you every day. Curtis sat on the bed beside his son. I need to tell you something important. Next weekend, during the party, some dangerous things might happen. I'm going to handle it, but I need you to be ready to do exactly what I tell you. What kind of dangerous things? The kind that mean you'll need to stay close to Uncle Benny and do whatever he says without question. Tommy nodded gravely. At 14, he was old enough to understand that his father was preparing for something serious. Dad, are you going to be okay? Curtis looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw a young man who had been forced to grow up too quickly because of his mother's choices. I'm going to be fine, but after next weekend, our family is going to look very different. Different how? Your mother won't be living here anymore. Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Good, he finally said, and Curtis heard the cold finality in his son's voice that reminded him of himself. Meanwhile, at the warehouse in Long Beach, Trevor was briefing his crew on the final details of their plan. The anniversary party represented the perfect opportunity. Dozens of wealthy guests, predictable security routines, and Kristen's inside knowledge of the house layout. The security rotation changes at 11:30, Trevor explained, pointing to a blueprint of the Robertson estate that Kristen had provided. That gives us a 15-minute window when the rear perimeter is minimally covered. Ricky Hartman studied the security schematics. These systems are high-end, military-grade. That's where our inside information becomes invaluable. Trevor smiled. Kristen will ensure that key sensors are offline for maintenance during the crucial window. What none of them knew was that Curtis had already changed every security protocol they thought they understood. The sensors Kristen believed she could disable had been replaced. The rotation schedules had been altered. Most importantly, the wealthy guests would include some very dangerous men who were prepared for exactly this kind of situation. Mario Knight, the enforcer, seemed nervous. This Robertson guy, he's ex-military, right? And his company provides security for some heavy hitters. He's a businessman now. Trevor dismissed the concern. Soft, comfortable. He'll fold when he sees real violence. Trevor's assessment would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Curtis Robertson had never been soft, and comfort had never made him careless. If anything, having something precious to protect had made him more dangerous than he'd ever been in the Marines. As Curtis prepared for bed that night, he reflected on how perfectly his enemies had positioned themselves for destruction. They thought they were hunting him, but they had actually walked into a trap that had been months in the making. Tomorrow, he would make the final preparations. And next weekend, Kristen and Trevor would learn the true meaning of betrayal. Chapter 5. The Trap is Set. The morning of the anniversary party, Curtis awoke before dawn and found Kristen already up, pacing nervously in their bedroom. She was fully dressed despite the early hour, her hands shaking slightly as she applied her makeup. "You're up early," Curtis observed, his tone casual. "Couldn't sleep. I want everything to be perfect tonight." The irony of her words wasn't lost on Curtis. "It will be memorable," he assured her, and meant it completely. Curtis spent the morning making final preparations with his team. Omar had positioned 12 former Special Forces operatives throughout the property, disguised as catering staff, security personnel, and even guests. Each man was armed and briefed on the expected threat. Benny arrived early to take Tommy to what Curtis had told Kristen was a sleepover at his cousin's house. In reality, Tommy would be staying at a safe house with round-the-clock protection until the situation was resolved. "Remember what we talked about," Curtis told his son as Benny prepared to leave. "I know, Dad. Whatever happens tonight, you had to do it." The understanding in his son's eyes, both proud and heartbroken Curtis. Tommy had learned harsh truths about loyalty and betrayal that would serve him well in life, even if the lessons had come at a terrible cost. As evening approached, guests began arriving for what they believed was simply an anniversary celebration. The Henderson family was there, along with other high-profile clients and their security details. What made this gathering unique was the presence of Omar's carefully selected guests, men who looked like successful businessmen, but moved with the predatory grace of apex predators. Kristen played her part perfectly, greeting guests with charm and grace while her eyes constantly tracked the security personnel. She was mentally noting rotations and positions, unaware that everything she thought she knew about the evening security was wrong. At exactly 10:30 p.m., Curtis watched from his office security monitors as Kristen excused herself from the party. According to the plan she thought she was following, this was when she would disable key sensors and unlock certain doors. Instead, Curtis watched her trigger additional alarms and security measures that she didn't know existed. Trevor and his crew were already in position in the woods behind the estate. They had night vision equipment and weapons, believing they were about to execute a sophisticated robbery. In reality, they were walking into what would become their tomb. Curtis activated his communications system, connecting him to Omar and the entire security team. All units, targets are in position. Phase 2 is go. At 11:15 p.m., exactly when they thought the security rotation would create their window, Trevor's crew moved toward the house. They expected to encounter minimal resistance and a predictable security response. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by professionals who had been tracking their every movement for hours. Ricky Hartman was the first to realize something was wrong when his electronic jamming equipment failed to disable the house's communications. "Trevor, something's not right. The systems aren't responding." "Stick to the plan," Trevor hissed, but his confidence was already wavering. Inside the house, Kristen was growing increasingly panicked as her attempts to disable security systems failed. Every code she entered was rejected. Every sensor she tried to bypass remained active. When she attempted to unlock the rear entrance for Trevor's entry, she triggered a silent alarm that immediately alerted Curtis. Curtis made his move at 11:30 p.m. He approached Kristen in the hallway, where she was desperately trying to access a control panel. "Having trouble with the security system?" he asked quietly. Kristen spun around, her face pale. "Curtis, you startled me. The alarm seemed to be malfunctioning." "No malfunction," Curtis replied, his voice carrying a deadly calm. "Everything is working exactly as intended." The realization hit Kristen like a physical blow. Curtis knew. The knowledge was written in his steel-gray eyes, and she understood that her carefully constructed deception had crumbled completely. "Curtis, I can explain." "No need. I've been watching you for weeks. I know about Trevor, about the plan, about everything." Outside, Trevor's crew was discovering that their intelligence was not just wrong. It was a carefully constructed trap. As they approached the house, motion sensors they couldn't see tracked their movements. When they reached what should have been their entry point, they found themselves in a killing field with armed men positioned at every possible escape route. Mario Knight was the first to panic. "This is a setup. We need to abort." But it was too late. Omar's voice cut through the night air, amplified by speakers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Trevor Galvin, Ricky Hartman, Mario Knight, and Wendell Camacho. You are surrounded by armed security personnel. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." Trevor realized with dawning horror that Curtis not only knew who they were, but had been planning for this moment far longer than they had been planning their heist. Inside the house, Curtis continued his confrontation with Kristen while the party guests remained oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. "You sold out your family for what? A has-been trainer with criminal connections?" Curtis's voice dripped with contempt. "You don't understand. I understand that you gave him access to our home, our son, our lives. I understand that you were planning to help him rob our guests and steal information that could get people killed." Kristen's composure finally cracked. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt. Your intentions are irrelevant. Your actions put Tommy in danger. That's unforgivable." Outside, the confrontation was escalating. Wendell Camacho, the electronic specialist, made a desperate run for the tree line and was immediately tackled by two of Omar's men. Ricky Hartman tried to use his burglar tools to override a security door and received a painful shock from an electrified handle. Trevor, realizing that his crew was falling apart, made a fatal decision. He pulled out a pistol and fired warning shots into the air, hoping to create enough chaos to escape. The gunshots changed everything. What had been a controlled takedown became an active combat situation. Omar's men, all veterans with combat experience, responded with overwhelming force. Curtis heard the gunshots through his earpiece and made his own final move. The party's over, Kristen. Chapter 6. Blood in the Water. The gunshots shattered the evening's elegant facade. Curtis activated the estate's lockdown protocols, sealing all exits and triggering bulletproof barriers that transformed the mansion into an impregnable fortress. The party guests, now understanding that something serious was happening, were quickly moved to a secure area by Omar's disguised operatives. Outside, Trevor's crew found themselves in a nightmare scenario. Omar's team had night vision equipment, superior positioning, and the tactical experience to end the confrontation quickly. When Trevor fired his warning shots, he sealed his crew's fate. Target has fired on security personnel. Omar's voice crackled through Curtis's earpiece. We are cleared for lethal force. Curtis felt a cold satisfaction as he heard the controlled violence erupting outside. These men had threatened his family, his son, his life's work. They deserved everything that was coming to them. Ricky Hartman, desperate to escape, tried to scale the estate's security fence and was brought down by a taser that dropped him convulsing to the ground. Mario Knight attempted to use his enforcer tactics, threatening to kill hostages he didn't have, but found himself facing men who had handled real terrorists and weren't impressed by street-level intimidation. Wendell Camacho, the electronics expert, tried to use his knowledge of security systems to find an escape route, but Curtis had anticipated this and had placed false schematics in the materials Kristen had provided. Every route Wendell thought would lead to safety instead led him deeper into the trap. Inside the house, Curtis continued his confrontation with Kristen while monitoring the situation through his security feeds. On the screens, he could see Trevor making increasingly desperate attempts to escape, unaware that every exit had been anticipated and blocked. This is what you chose, Curtis told his wife, gesturing toward the monitors showing the chaos outside. You brought armed criminals to our home, where our son lives. Kristen was sobbing now, the reality of her situation finally penetrating her self-deception. I never thought it would come to this. Trevor said it would be simple. Just some files and jewelry. Trevor lied to you, just like you lied to me. The difference is, his lies were more honest about their intentions. Curtis activated his communication system and spoke directly to Trevor through the external speakers. Trevor Galvin, this is Curtis Robertson. Your plan failed. Your crew is neutralized. You have one chance to surrender and live through the next 5 minutes. Trevor's response came in the form of more gunfire, this time directed at the house itself. The bullets struck reinforced windows designed to withstand such attacks, leaving barely visible spiderweb cracks. Poor choice, Curtis murmured, then spoke into his comm system. Omar in this. What followed was a masterclass in tactical operations. Omar's team moved with precision and overwhelming force. Ricky Hartman, still recovering from the taser, was zip-tied and secured. Wendell Camacho, cornered in what he thought was an escape route, surrendered when faced with 3 assault rifles aimed at his chest. Mario Knight tried to fight and learned the difference between intimidating civilians and facing trained killers. He was subdued with minimum necessary force, which still left him unconscious and bleeding. Trevor, isolated and desperate, made his final stand near the estate's guest house. He had taken cover behind a decorative fountain and was firing wildly at shapes in the darkness, unaware that night vision scopes had been tracking his every movement for the past hour. Trevor Galvin. Omar's amplified voice cut through the night. Drop your weapon. This is your final warning. Trevor's response was to fire in the direction of Omar's voice, a mistake that revealed his exact position to 3 different marksmen who had been waiting for clear shots. Curtis watched the final moments through his security feeds with clinical detachment. Trevor had chosen violence over surrender, had threatened Curtis's family and guests, and had fired on security personnel. In Curtis's moral framework, Trevor had forfeited any claim to mercy. The end came quickly. 3 precisely placed shots from different angles ensured that Trevor's threat ended permanently. His crew would survive to face prosecution, but Trevor Galvin had crossed a line that Curtis considered unforgivable. Inside the house, Kristen watched her husband's face as he observed her lover's death on the security monitors. There was no satisfaction, no emotion at all, just the cold calculation of a man who had eliminated a threat to his family. "You killed him," she whispered. "He killed himself when he chose to bring violence to my home," Curtis replied. "Just like you killed our marriage when you chose to betray our family." The police sirens were already approaching. Curtis had called them himself once the shooting started, confident that his actions would be ruled justified defense of his property and guests. Curtis turned to face his wife fully for the first time that evening. "Kristen, you have a choice to make. You can cooperate with the police investigation, admit your role in this conspiracy, and accept whatever consequences come. Or you can try to lie your way out of this and discover what happens to people who continue to threaten my family." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Trevor is dead, his crew is captured, and you are now the only loose end in a very dangerous situation. How I handle that loose end depends entirely on your next decisions." Kristen understood the implicit threat. Curtis had just demonstrated his willingness and ability to eliminate threats to his family. She was now faced with a choice between cooperation and potentially joining Trevor in death. "What do you want me to do?" "Tell the truth. All of it. The affair, the plan, your cooperation with criminals who intended to rob our guests and steal information that could get people killed. Accept responsibility for your choices." As police cars flooded the estate's driveway, Curtis felt a cold satisfaction. The immediate threat was ended, but his revenge was just beginning. Kristen would face public humiliation and criminal charges, but that was only the first phase of her punishment. The real destruction was yet to come. Chapter 7: The Reckoning. Detective Benny Ross arrived with the first wave of police units, immediately taking charge of the crime scene. As Curtis's half-brother, he had to recuse himself from the primary investigation, but his presence ensured that the initial response favored Curtis's narrative of defending his home against armed intruders. The scene that greeted the police was unambiguous, for armed men had attempted to rob a private residence during a social gathering. Trevor Galvin was dead. His 3 associates were in custody, and a significant amount of evidence supported the homeowner's claim of justified defense. Curtis met with the lead detective, Lloyd Parrish, in his home office while crime scene technicians processed the exterior grounds. Curtis presented himself as a shocked homeowner who had discovered his wife's affair and suspected that her lover might try something desperate. "I had increased security for tonight's party specifically because I was concerned about Trevor's criminal background," Curtis explained, showing Detective Parrish the file Benny had compiled weeks earlier. "I never imagined it would escalate to armed robbery." Kristen's questioning was conducted separately. She had 2 choices: tell the truth about her involvement and face criminal conspiracy charges, or lie to police and risk Curtis exposing even more damaging information. Curtis had made it clear that her cooperation was the only thing standing between her and complete destruction. Faced with evidence of her communications with Trevor, the keys she had provided him, and security footage of her attempting to disable alarms during the robbery, Kristen chose cooperation. Her tearful confession to Detective Parrish painted a picture of a lonely wife manipulated by a sophisticated criminal. "He said it would just be some jewelry and cash," she sobbed. "I never knew he was planning to steal Curtis's client files or that he would bring guns. I thought I was just helping him get back at Curtis for being so controlling." Her partial truths satisfied the immediate investigation while protecting Curtis from deeper scrutiny. She admitted to the affair and to providing Trevor with access to the house, but portrayed herself as a victim of manipulation rather than an active conspirator. The surviving members of Trevor's crew each faced different fates. Wendell Camacho, the electronic specialist, had no prior violent crimes and agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. Ricky Hartman, with multiple prior convictions, faced significant prison time but would eventually be released. Mario Knight, the enforcer, had outstanding warrants in 3 states and would likely die in prison. None of them would ever speak about the job again. Omar's team had made it very clear during their capture that any discussion of the Robertson family security arrangements would be considered a continued threat requiring permanent resolution. As dawn broke over the estate, Curtis stood in his office reviewing the night's events. The immediate threat was ended, but his revenge against Kristen was just beginning. The criminal charges she faced were merely the opening act of her destruction. Jeffrey Galvin, Curtis's lawyer, arrived as the police were finishing their initial investigation. He brought with him divorce papers that would devastate Kristen's financial future and ensure that her betrayal carried lasting consequences. The prenuptial agreement is very specific about adultery, Jeffrey explained. She forfeits any claim to marital assets, the house, and significant alimony. She'll receive a minimal settlement, enough to survive, but nothing approaching the lifestyle she's become accustomed to. What about custody of Tommy? Given her involvement in criminal conspiracy that endangered the child, you'll receive full custody with minimal visitation rights for her. The court will view her actions as fundamentally incompatible with responsible parenting. Curtis felt a cold satisfaction as he reviewed the legal documents. Kristen would lose her home, her lifestyle, her son, and her social standing. She would be publicly humiliated and financially ruined. But Curtis wasn't finished with her yet. The morning after the raid, Curtis visited Tommy at the safe house where Benny had taken him. His son looked older somehow, as if the events had accelerated his transition from boy to man. "Is it over?" Tommy asked. "The immediate danger is over. Your mother will be facing criminal charges for her part in the plan, and will be getting divorced." Tommy nodded solemnly. "Good. I can't forgive her for what she did to us." Curtis studied his son's face and saw his own ruthless nature reflected there. Tommy had learned that betrayal carried consequences, that loyalty was not something to be taken lightly, and that sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones who hurt you most. "Are you okay with it just being us?" Curtis asked. "Yeah, Dad. We don't need her." The investigation continued for several days, but the conclusion was foregone. The physical evidence, witness statements, and Kristen's own confession painted a clear picture of a justified defense against armed intruders. Curtis was cleared of any wrongdoing, and the media coverage portrayed him as a hero who had protected his guests from violent criminals. Kristen's role in the conspiracy received less media attention, partly due to Curtis's influence with local news outlets, and partly because her lawyers encouraged her to maintain a low profile. She was charged with conspiracy to commit burglary and providing material support to criminals, charges that would likely result in probation given her cooperation and lack of prior criminal history. But the legal consequences were only the beginning of her punishment. Curtis had spent weeks preparing a campaign of social and financial destruction that would follow her for years. He leaked information about the affair to every social circle they had shared, ensuring that Kristen would be ostracized from the elite community she had worked so hard to join. He used his business connections to ensure that she would find it difficult to obtain employment in any respectable field. Most devastating of all, he arranged for the media to receive details about her role in the conspiracy that painted her as a willing participant rather than a manipulated victim. Within 2 weeks of the raid, Kristen had been evicted from the estate, abandoned by most of her friends, and faced a future of social exile and financial hardship. She would survive, but the comfortable life she had known was over forever. Curtis felt no sympathy for her suffering. In his mind, she had made her choices and would live with the consequences. The woman who had betrayed her family and endangered her son deserved no mercy from the man she had wronged. Chapter 8. The Price of Betrayal. 3 months after the raid, Kristen Robertson sat in a cramped studio apartment in a declining neighborhood of Los Angeles, staring at yet another rejection letter. Her attempts to find employment had been systematically sabotaged by Curtis's far-reaching influence in business circles. Every application seemed to result in sudden disinterest once prospective employers learned her name. The criminal case had concluded with a plea bargain that gave her 2 years probation and 500 hours of community service. She had avoided prison, but the conviction meant that many professional opportunities were permanently closed to her. More devastating was the complete social exile she now experienced. The divorce proceedings had been brutal. Jeffrey Galvin had methodically dismantled every argument her lawyers presented, using the prenuptial agreement and her criminal conviction to strip away any claim to the life she had known. The final settlement left her with barely enough to rent her current apartment and buy necessities. Kristen had been allowed to see Tommy exactly 3 times since the raid, supervised visits that had been painfully awkward. Her son treated her with polite indifference, as if she were a stranger rather than his mother. The 14-year-old boy had clearly absorbed his father's lesson about the consequences of betrayal. "I don't understand why you did it, Mom," Tommy had said during their last visit. "We had everything. Dad loved you. I loved you. Why wasn't that enough?" Kristen had no answer that would satisfy him or herself. The affair with Trevor seemed like a fever dream now, a destructive impulse that had cost her everything precious in her life. Meanwhile, Curtis had rebuilt his family's life with methodical precision. He had increased his company's security protocols and client base, using the attempted robbery as a marketing tool that demonstrated his firm's effectiveness. The story of the executive who had single-handedly defeated armed intruders had become legendary in security industry circles. Tommy had adapted to their new family structure with the resilience of youth. Curtis made sure to spend more time with his son, teaching him lessons about loyalty, strength, and the importance of choosing allies carefully. "Your mother made choices that put our family at risk," Curtis explained during one of their evening talks. "Sometimes people we trust will disappoint us. The key is to learn from their failures and never repeat their mistakes." Curtis also ensured that his son understood the importance of consequences. Tommy had seen firsthand how betrayal led to destruction, how loyalty was rewarded and disloyalty was punished. These were lessons that would shape the young man's character for life. But Curtis wasn't satisfied with Kristen's current level of suffering. In his mind, she had endangered Tommy and violated the sacred trust of family. Her punishment needed to be more comprehensive and permanent. Using his connections in the private investigation industry, Curtis began implementing the next phase of her destruction. He arranged for Kristen to be repeatedly scammed by predatory financial services that targeted vulnerable people. Her credit was systematically destroyed through carefully orchestrated identity theft that could never be traced back to Curtis. Medical bills for treatments she never received appeared on her credit report. Utility companies demanded payment for services at addresses where she had never lived. Collection agencies pursued her for debts that didn't exist but were impossible to disprove without expensive legal representation she couldn't afford. Kristen found herself trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare where her attempts to clear her name only resulted in more problems. Every agency she contacted referred her to another agency, each demanding payments she couldn't make to resolve issues she hadn't created. The psychological pressure was immense. Kristen began suffering from anxiety attacks and depression, conditions that made it even harder for her to find employment or maintain relationships. She had lost weight, her health was declining, and she lived in constant fear of eviction or arrest for debts she couldn't pay. Curtis monitored her deterioration through private investigators and felt a cold satisfaction at her suffering. In his worldview, she was experiencing exactly what she deserved. The woman who had betrayed her family was learning that actions had consequences that extended far beyond immediate punishment. One evening, as Curtis reviewed the latest reports on Kristen's declining situation, Tommy knocked on his office door. "Dad, can I ask you something about Mom?" Curtis looked up from his paperwork. "What do you want to know? Are you ever going to forgive her?" The question was direct and unexpected. Curtis studied his son's face, looking for signs of sympathy for Kristen that might need to be corrected. "Why do you ask?" "I saw her at the grocery store last week. She looked really bad, Dad. Thin and scared. I almost didn't recognize her." Curtis felt a moment of concern that his son might be developing misplaced sympathy for the woman who had betrayed them. "How would that make you feel?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "I felt sorry for her, but I also felt angry that I felt sorry for her. Does that make sense?" Curtis nodded approvingly. His son was experiencing the natural human response to suffering while also maintaining the emotional discipline to remember why that suffering was justified. "Your mother made choices that could have gotten us killed," Curtis reminded him. "She chose her own pleasure over our family's safety. The consequences she's experiencing now are the direct result of those choices. But will it ever be enough? Will you ever stop punishing her?" Curtis considered the question carefully. In truth, He had no intention of ever stopping. In his mind, Kristen's betrayal was unforgivable, and her punishment should be permanent. But he also recognized that his son needed to understand justice rather than cruelty. When someone betrays their family, they forfeit their right to mercy, Curtis finally answered. Your mother will live with the consequences of her choices for the rest of her life, just as we have to live with the trauma she caused us. Tommy accepted this explanation, but Curtis sensed that his son was beginning to develop his own moral framework that might not perfectly align with Curtis's desire for perpetual revenge. It was a development that Curtis would need to monitor carefully. The last thing he wanted was for misplaced compassion to interfere with the important lessons Tommy was learning about loyalty and consequences. Chapter 9. The Final Lesson. 2 years after the raid, Curtis stood in his office reviewing quarterly reports that showed his security company had tripled in size. The story of the executive who had defeated armed intruders had become industry legend, bringing him high-profile clients from across the country. Tommy, now 16, was thriving in his private school and had grown into a confident young man who understood the value of loyalty and strength. The latest surveillance report on Kristen showed that she was living in a homeless shelter and working part-time at a laundromat. Her health had deteriorated significantly due to stress, poor nutrition, and untreated medical conditions. She looked decades older than her actual age and showed signs of severe depression. Curtis felt no sympathy as he reviewed the photographs. In his mind, every aspect of her suffering was justified by her betrayal of their family. She had chosen to endanger Tommy and violate the sacred trust of marriage. The consequences were appropriate and permanent. A knock on his office door interrupted his review. Tommy entered, carrying a college acceptance letter from Stanford. "Dad, I got in," Tommy announced with quiet pride. Curtis felt a surge of paternal satisfaction. His son had maintained perfect grades while learning the hard lessons about family loyalty that would serve him throughout life. Congratulations. This is exactly what you've earned through your dedication and character. Tommy sat down across from his father's desk, but his expression wasn't entirely celebratory. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Curtis recognized the serious tone and gave his son full attention. "I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately. About what happened, about what's happening to her now." Curtis felt a familiar concern that his son might be developing misplaced sympathy for the woman who had betrayed them. "What specifically have you been thinking?" "I understand why she had to be punished. I understand that what she did was unforgivable. But I've been wondering if maybe the punishment should have an end point." Curtis studied his son's face carefully. Tommy had grown into a thoughtful young man with his own moral reasoning, which was both a source of pride and a potential complication. "Explain your thinking." "She's been living on the streets for 6 months. Her health is failing. She's not a threat to us anymore, and she's not capable of hurting anyone else. At what point does justice become cruelty?" Curtis appreciated his son's analytical approach to the question, even if he disagreed with the conclusion. "Tommy, what your mother did wasn't just adultery. She collaborated with armed criminals who could have killed us both. She put your life at risk for her own selfish desires. That kind of betrayal doesn't have a statute of limitations. I know what she did was terrible. I'll never forgive her for it, and I don't want her back in our lives. But watching her destroy herself doesn't make me feel better about what happened. It just makes me feel like we're becoming something we shouldn't be." Curtis felt a mixture of pride and concern at his son's words. Tommy had developed strong moral reasoning and the confidence to express disagreement with his father. These were admirable traits that would serve him well in life. However, Curtis also recognized that mercy could be seen as weakness, and weakness invited further betrayal. "What do you think we should do?" "I think we should stop. Not forgive her, not take her back, not pretend that what she did was acceptable, but stop actively destroying her. Let her live with the natural consequences of her choices without us making those consequences worse." Curtis considered his son's proposal. The active campaign against Kristen had required significant resources and attention that could be better directed toward building their future. Tommy would be leaving for college soon, and Curtis wanted his son to respect him rather than fear him. If we stop the active measures against her, what message does that send about the consequences of betraying family? It sends the message that we're strong enough to move on, that we don't need to keep proving our point because everyone already understands it. Curtis realized that his son had matured beyond his expectations. Tommy wasn't advocating for forgiveness or reconciliation. He was suggesting that continued revenge was beneath them. It was a sophisticated moral position that demonstrated strength rather than weakness. Very well, Curtis decided. We'll stop the active measures. She'll live with the consequences of her choices, but we won't make those consequences worse. Tommy nodded gratefully. Thank you, Dad. That evening, Curtis called off the private investigators and financial harassment campaigns that had been systematically destroying Kristen's life. She would continue to live with the natural consequences of her criminal conviction, social exile, and financial ruin, but Curtis would no longer actively make her situation worse. 6 months later, Curtis received word that Kristen had died of complications from pneumonia while living in a homeless shelter. She had been found with a letter addressed to Tommy, which Curtis read before deciding whether to share it with his son. The letter was a simple apology acknowledging her betrayal and expressing regret for the choices that had destroyed their family. She asked for no forgiveness and made no excuses, simply stating that she hoped Tommy would learn from her mistakes and build a better life than she had managed. Curtis showed the letter to Tommy, who read it without emotion. "How do you feel?" Curtis asked. "Sad that it ended this way, but not sorry that it's over," Tommy replied. "She made her choices, and she lived with them. That's more honest than most people manage." Curtis felt a deep satisfaction at his son's response. Tommy had learned the most important lesson of all, that loyalty was precious, betrayal was costly, and strong people moved forward rather than dwelling on those who had failed them. The Robertson family legacy would continue with Tommy, who understood the value of loyalty and the price of betrayal. Curtis had built something permanent from the ashes of Kristen's destruction. A son who would never repeat her mistakes and would carry forward the lessons learned from her failure. In Curtis's mind, justice had been served completely. Kristen had paid the ultimate price for her betrayal, and Tommy had learned the importance of choosing loyalty over temptation. The family name was stronger than ever, and the future was secure. The story of betrayal and revenge had reached its conclusion, with loyalty triumphant and betrayal punished. Curtis Robertson had protected his family's honor and ensured that the lessons learned would guide them for generations to come. As he stood in his office that evening, looking out over the estate that Kristen had tried to help criminals rob, Curtis felt a cold satisfaction. He had won completely and permanently. The weak had been eliminated, the strong had survived, and justice had been served without compromise or mercy. In Curtis Robertson's world, that was exactly how it should be. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.